Man, there are so many jokes I can make out of that title in this video. Hey everybody, and welcome back to the wonderful world of the Capcom additional narrative. Last time we took a look at Natalia's addition to the canon, and now we get to focus on Moira, and if you didn't see the main review video, I will remind you that out of the 4 protagonists of Revies 2, Moira was my absolute favorite, mostly because whoever was writing her script actually made her come across like a human being instead of a slightly angry robot hauling 5 firearms on its back. Now, the story of this DLC is set between the events of chapters 2 and 3 of Revies 2, so expect a lot of spoilers for what happens in the main game here. Well, let's get to the first spoiler and remind you guys of the context of this DLC. The struggle takes place between the events of chapters 2 and 3 after Claire and Moira got trapped up on a tower in the island, and after an accident separated the pair, Claire was found on the seas and using her super duper luck powers managed to attract a helicopter to herself and get rescued for medical treatment, whereupon she meets Barry Burton and tells him of the island and inadvertently sent someone to rescue Moira. Considering what happened, Moira might have ended up being even luckier than Claire, since she was left supposedly badly injured after the accident on a zombie-infested hellscape. One of the handful of sane people left found her. Slavic guy. He does have an actual name, but unlike Dimitri of Resident Evil 3, it's impossible for my stupid American brain to pronounce, so he's going to be known hereforth as Slavic Guy. The school system fucking rules. We did get to meet this guy briefly in the main game, and he did come across as an incredibly combative person who saw a lot of shit and was just done with the whole thing, locking himself in a room and failing to do anything towards Claire and Moira. Apparently, Capcom thought that this character was worth exploring in further detail, mostly because he's probably the only person who's still alive on this island after the events of Chapter 2. The gap between chapters was 6 months, and with the help of Slavic Guy, Moira managed pretty well on this desolate island for that amount of time. Unlike Little Miss, Capcom decided to not reinvent the wheel with the struggle, and it ends up being a lot more straightforward on its narrative and in its gameplay, and I suppose the developers thought they needed to add something, anything, to make this game look like it was actually worthwhile as a standalone purchase, so the idea they came up with was a baffling and brand new mechanic to the struggle of finishing this: the ration system. Like the stealth in Little Miss, the ration system in the Struggle of Thrones was an amazingly rudimentary form of, I guess, survival games, where the player has to spend the first couple of levels going out and hunting animals to gain rations, and rations end up being the amount of times that you are allowed to fail at the DLC before the entire run gets burned and you have to start at the start again. It sounds pretty draconian, but the entire mechanic in the struggle for couch pennies is actually pretty pointless because in spite of the problems we'll talk about later, dying in the struggle is actually pretty uncommon, and who cares if you even manage to lose all of your continues. Just like Little Miss, you'll only be cracking around an hour or an hour 20 on this DLC before it's all done. Otherwise, the gameplay itself is stolen straight from the main game, which is fair considering that it's continuing right after the events of the main game. I'm still going to say that since this is a review and the person watching this should know, for purchasing reasons, that the gameplay doesn't change one bit beyond changing what you are shooting throughout. Just run around and shoot things, there you go. So you go through another bunch of the reused levels and fight the same enemies. Again, this is Capcom DLC, so don't expect a lot of reinvestment in making it unique. And after the first couple timed levels, which allows you to get a baseline of rations, so you don't immediately fail like the first 10 minutes I played Resi 0, didn't create an initial save state and immediately died to the first zombies because I was an idiot. So modern Capcom gets your back somewhat. This DLC does need to go somewhere because this is a story, so Moira in her Moira-y way decides to fuck something up and tried to find a way to leave the island faster than 6 months, and mostly ended up accomplishing aggroing a bunch of zombies in the sewers, and Slavic guy had to come save her from her shit fit, and ended up putting her right back into the same mad at her father position she was at the beginning of Revy's 2. But the important thing about this segue is the change in combat style that we will have relatively long-standing effects in the DLC. Instead of being a bunch of timed survival shootouts over and over again, the struggle for low-cost housing becomes a wave-based survival minigame repeated around 7 times. Yep, the eternal white noise of creativity makes up about 80% of the entire DLC. Here's a bunch of zombies, go kill them all, champ. Which would be fine if we were fighting those lame-oid afflicteds the whole time, but as we know, things started to change on the island as Alex continued deteriorating, and so the afflicted start to advance into the revenants, spitters, and eventually to the Durga. Combine the rising power of the enemies with the limited ammunition throughout, and you have a recipe for mild annoyance. I remember having a bunch of hard times with some of these survival waves, which I hate because they're lazy, stupid, and a really good way for the developer to screw the player down to their last resources in a way to build bullshit challenges. The one that was the one to overcome was the one of the last ones in the mining facility, where they started introducing spitters who could lob at long range alongside those Durga, and the jellyfish-looking ones that have the core in the middle of themselves and were surrounded by corpses attached to their heads, which made their cores hard to hit. Their attacks were a bit more unpredictable, and at that point, I was basically scratching for every single bullet that I could find. Slavic guy theoretically had infinite ammunition, but to compensate for that, his AI randomly half forgets what self-preservation means, so he's about as reliable in a shootout as your drunk friend. At least Slavic guy won't shoot you in your knees. A good strategy for this would be to fall onto that COD Zombies tradition and barricade yourself into choke points and use your environment to your advantage so that you waste less bullets and don't back yourself into corners. So, after a good 40 to 50 minutes of repeatedly murdering a set number of jerkwads in a bunch of reused maps, the struggle for independence comes to a head as Slavic guy finds the final piece of evidence that his daughter on the island has been kidnapped and sacrificed to the inhuman experiments on the island, and so in his sorrow and shame by the end of the DLC, Slavic guy locks Moira out of his life and sends her off to be her own woman as he retires himself to the close end of his life locked in that room in despair up until the point we meet him again in the main game and he annoys the protagonist slightly. To be fair to Capcom, since Moira has attachment issues and is closer to a human being than most video game characters, the separation between her and Slavic guy comes off more heartfelt and meaningful than you would think in such a project like this, which is again probably coming from the talent of whoever is writing Moira's script, rather than the DLC being well conceived. Whether or not they want to admit it, by the end, Moira and Slavic guy were putting commitment into their survivalist relationship, and even though they're both stubborn as hell when they're eye to eye, cutting apart their partnership still hurt and affected them both. With some newfound confidence in herself and a lot of leftover food, Moira heads back out to the island alone to face the challenge and meet up again with Claire along with a couple other people she didn't expect. In conclusion, I really do not like those dumbass wave-based challenges. I just hate them for the reasons already mentioned. I think it's really lazy, and it's a good way to screw over players and make them repeat things over and over again, which is why these wave-based survival shit things are usually sequestered away in their own modes because they're there for the people chasing challenge. They're supposed to be challenging, they're not supposed to be part of the main game, because it's so easy for the ending super baddies because everything's rising in escalation and difficulty, and therefore you're losing supplies along with that rise. It's really easy by the end to get totally burned out of a run because of a couple of mistakes just due to the rising difficulty. That's why I think it's so freaking annoying. But otherwise, I think the struggle of the hunt is better written than Little Miss and has somewhat of an enjoyable shooter gameplay to it rather than just controller snapping stealth. Moira is a really fleshed out character, and getting to see an arc in this microcosm of a situation gives her more pathos and helps to flesh out the character of Slavic Guy, who was someone completely forgotten by the characters in the game and his creator in real life. Giving him some actual traits and a little bit of a backstory actually goes a lot further than you would think, since they put a little bit of effort into it, and it feels like Capcom at least spent some time thinking about what they put on his character sheet and what they put into the plot, rather than Little Miss's repeated bullspit. It's not exactly going to rival any of the main chapters, but at least the struggle here today is getting closer to earning its $5 price point, and is a good use of an additional hour if you want to spend more time with Revies 2 before whatever else comes out next week. Yeah, I'm thinking a big reason why I'm giving the struggle the edge over the Little Miss is simply because Moira was there, and Moira is the best, so yeah, totally biased critique, and you can't trust me ever again. Team Moira forever!